Hey, how's it going? Welcome to my channel. Before we get into the video, I just wanted to say this took a little bit longer than expected, and it's not because I was really distracted or this was specifically difficult. It was just, this was supposed to be a different video for Knights of the Old Republic, but the game was broken for me. I can't seem to get any mods or the patches to actually fix the problem, so I kind of just have to move on. I hope I can fix it for my next video, but we'll see from there. The game I'm playing for this video, as you might have noticed from the thumbnail or the title, is Phantom Dust. It's a game developed by Yukio Futsugi and Microsoft that came out in North America in 2005. It was not really that well received, but not because it's a bad game. Many people may have just been under the impression that the game had been cancelled for North America, and this was only a half-truth because Microsoft did not decide to publish it for us. Majesco decided to license it instead. Even though it wasn't really that well received, Microsoft looked into making an online reboot several years later, and Darkside Games got the right to develop it. Something weird happened though during the development for an E3 2014 event when a trailer for the reboot was released and confirmed, but it didn't mention Darkside at all, and it was released without their knowledge. This trailer didn't even contain any of the assets that was created for Darksides for the reboot, and it was just kind of a CGI render. There were some complications during the development when Microsoft asked for a single-player experience to be added to the game. Now, Darksides asked for some more time and money to make the project the way it's needed to be done, but Microsoft wasn't interested in this and canceled the whole project. Darkside Games would end up closing their doors soon after, but Microsoft still gave the fans the remastered games a couple years later, and even now you're able to get the game for free on the Xbox store. It's just unfortunate that we're probably not going to get a sequel to the game. Microsoft doesn't actually see value in the intellectual property, unfortunately. I never got a chance to play online and won't be playing it now. There just wasn't many games at the time. I'm going to be playing the scenario mode, which is essentially this game's single player. The game does have a story, but it's a little convoluted. All you need to know right now is that we play an unnamed Esper with almost no memories. All the characters are in a similar situation where the only thing they remember is a strange ruin, and none of this is elaborated on for a good period of time. Pretty much all we're told is the world is covered in this strange dust known as the Phantom Dust, and the surviving humans live underground to protect themselves from its effects. This is pretty much all you need to know for now, so let's talk about the actual game and get into things. When you enter the game, you might notice that there's a minimap, but it really doesn't indicate anything. It won't tell you where the NPCs are or where your mission is. All it does is flash in the area you're in. This won't be a problem now, but it will be later on. We have to go on a mission to get tested as an Esper, and the very first thing we learn how to do when we get in that mission is learn how to move the camera, which is confusing because we've already had to do this. So after this, you learn how to lock on, which is a much more useful tutorial. Now what I wish they did here was teach us how to switch between enemies. We don't learn that until next mission, but I don't see why we couldn't learn it now. This tutorial also touches on health and aura, but it's not the biggest deal right now since every mission you start at 20 health and the tutorial will start with 5 aura. Aura is used to cast your abilities. You could think of it like land in Magic the Gathering. In normal missions, you'll always start at 0, so you have to activate the aura on your own. If you pick up your attack skill, you just need to kill the enemy. And when you complete the mission, you will always get credits, a memory shard, and a skill. The credit reward grows, and the skills get better, but you're always going to get 1 memory shard. Many of the tutorial missions are just teaching you something basic, then forcing you to beat the enemy. So you are technically learning things, but the tutorial is 2 hours long, so I can imagine a few people are quitting before they get to the good part of the game. I don't want to go through everything in the tutorial since that'll take a while. We get many missions where they introduce us to different types of skills, and each one has their own orb color. This does help identify what skills you have, but you're still going to have to stand over to see what the skill is exactly. Now I'm going to give you a simplified overview of the different ones real quick, just because I don't want to go through each and every mission, but essentially there's the red orbs, which we covered in the first mission. Then we learn about blue orbs, which are defensive skills. Yellow orbs are special skills that do things like let you dash or levitate. Green orbs are status skills, which do things like buff you or debuff your opponent. I like the heat skill they gave for us for this mission, but I didn't acquire this until much later in the game, so it was kind of disappointing. And the last type are purple orbs, which do things like erasing the person's skill or aura. There is one more type of skill, but we didn't get it until the end of the game, so there's no point in going over it now. The game does go over ranged skills and melee skills with you in their own individual missions, and they can get kind of complicated. It's strange how difficult some of these missions can be, but they're really not that important. They could have put a couple of these things into one mission, really. There's one mission where you're sent to find a downed NPC, and I'm not really sure why we're taught this, because we never need to do it again, so it's really just a waste of our time. One mission that is useful, but is probably more useful with a multiplayer setting, and that's teamwork. The allies you get in this game range from entirely useless to they could have completed it on their own, so it's hard to say if it's a real useful tutorial mission. Really, there's only one NPC that I like using when I get the chance to use him, and that's JD, since he's pretty much the best one there is. He does have a cool backstory too, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. There are two bosses in the tutorial, usually at the end of each of the chapters. First one's Freya. She's a woman narrator and a boss that we'll have to fight a couple times throughout the game. The second boss is named Picado. Picado serves no purpose to the story other than it was created to kill you. And I'm not the one saying this though, this is what an actual character says when it's introduced, so you can see what kind of writing we're going to be dealing with here. Picado is one of the large enemies in the game that requires a specific strategy to beat. These guys can usually be found at the end of a few of the chapters, but this one's the last enemy you'll fight before the end of the tutorial. Usually, a tutorial boss will allow a player to utilize the skills they were taught to defeat it, but not here. Many of the skills you have in your arsenal aren't even going to be able to hit it, and it requires good positioning and timing for the skills that do actually work. So after beating Picado in almost 2 hours of mostly trivial missions, you finally get to build your own arsenal. And no, you won't get most of the skills you used along the way, just the most basic ones. And this means no status or erase skills until you get them yourself. Sorry, before you actually build your arsenal, you need to go to Mac and get it first. Alright, who's Mac and where is he? To new players this might actually be a problem, but since I've played this before I knew he was just around the corner. But when I was a teenager, I didn't know this, and I did spend 15 minutes running from person to person. This running from person to person becomes an issue later on, but it's fine for now. The first time you visit the shop, there's a couple of tutorial videos about the shop and arsenal building, but they're pretty boring.
Edit Arsenal to see the list of skills contained in the arsenal. Here, you can change which skills are assigned to your arsenal. First, let me explain what's in the arsenal. First, you see a list of arsenals that are available to you.
At this point in the game, the only arsenal you have available is a 2-school arsenal, but you will unlock the 1-school and the 3-school by the end of the game. The tutorial doesn't talk about the differences in schools or arsenals, but essentially there are 5 separate schools. And each arsenal can only use between 1 and 3 schools, but it should be obvious to which one does what. The 1-school recharges aura faster than the 2-school, and the 2-school recharges aura faster than the 3-school. The schools are kind of explained in memory shards, but most of these things are kind of vague. I'm not going to give you the detailed version of each and every one of them, but here's a Cliff Note version of it. The Illuminati looking one has a lot of skills that like to hit the ceiling instead of the enemy. The one that reminds me of a hydrogen atom with an extra ring likes to curve into walls or just miss enemies entirely. The plant one uses elemental skills like fire and ice, but I mostly just use it for the tornado and flame sword. The yin and yang have a lot of melee skills, but are also very effective against me since I'm way too lazy to block most of the skills in the game. And the last one is the eyeball skill, which will totally kill you if you aren't paying attention. After the AI is done talking about the schools, it's going to talk about the basics of deck building. It doesn't matter which school you subscribe to right now because you don't have very many skills to play with. And to be clear on the terminology, I'm going to be using the terms deck and arsenal interchangeably. Deck building is a complicated topic since each person is going to play differently, but just keep your aura around 15. You're probably going to be changing or editing your arsenal every few missions anyways, if the game doesn't force you to. As I said before, this tutorial took me 2 hours to complete, but I'm sure you can do it much faster if you played in the past. I can't say the tutorial wasn't helpful as this is a deck building game. There is going to be a learning curve to understanding and executing strategies within the game's rules. It's just disappointing that the developers can teach us about the different skill types while also incorporating deck building in, since it is such an important thing in the game. This means that you will also get skills that you are required to put in your arsenal for the next mission. This happens throughout the game, so forcing you to get used to it during the tutorial would be helpful. Some of these skills are like compression and crystallization, where they require you to use the skills to progress, but if you enter the mission without reading the brief, you will need to quit the game to edit your arsenal because you won't be able to actually finish the mission. Now, both of these skills are really good, but to get the most use out of them, you need to build your arsenal around it, and I didn't realize that or appreciate that at the time. I only realized that later in the game when I actually had to go back and like rethink my whole style to beat the final boss, but we'll get into all that later. Now, I admit I don't read all the mission briefs, but most of the time they aren't telling you anything to complete the mission. You can just go in with whatever you're using and fight your way through it. For the missions, you should have read the brief. The game isn't going to stop you from trying it. I remember being a teenager and getting stuck on the compressor mission because I didn't know where in the map the compressor was. I didn't realize at the time that it was an actual skill, so I just kept running around the map looking for some button to press. It wouldn't be that big a deal, but there isn't an option to edit your arsenal between attempts. Just allowing us to switch our arsenals can improve the player experience, but the only way to switch arsenals now is in this room here. To edit your arsenal from a mission, you need to actually quit the game, back to the main menu, reselect scenario mode, run to the terminal, then back to the mission giver. And I get that this is supposed to be like an immersive way of editing your arsenal, but really it's just an annoyance and time consumer. Now let's talk about the maps a little. I won't go into detail about everything like I was originally planning to, but I would still want to talk about them. There aren't that many maps, so this shouldn't take too long. Each of the maps takes place in a recognizable location, places like a highway, a shopping mall, or an office building. All the maps have environments that are destructible, and this debris can actually hit someone and do damage to them. This is something you'll try to do often, as it can be pretty fun, and it can do a lot of damage, so it's worth the effort to try. A few of the maps, like Lanes, Strange City, and the final map, have these jump boosters that'll launch you in the air, and this will allow you to reach higher areas, or you could just shoot skills from this position. It's kind of hard to tell which skills can actually be shot from this, or which ones won't be, because there's no indicator in the skill description to tell you. Similarities aside, most of the maps play a little different from one another. Strange City is unique though. As the name says, there are some weird properties to the map. If something breaks, it won't fall to the ground like the other maps. It will kind of break and then fly in multiple directions. This, for the obvious fact that you can't see behind you, makes it for some interesting gameplay. And then there's one more map that I haven't mentioned at all, and that's Oil Rig, or just Rig by the name. All I can say about this one is that it's really easy to follow on the map. It has a lot of narrow walkways, but it's really open at the same time, so you can get hit with something and just get knocked off the edge. Or, my personal favorite, just lock onto someone and turn yourself off the edge yourself. Now, I actually had a lot more to talk about with these environments, but I didn't want to waste so much time talking about what's destructible and how you can use it and the strategies that go along with it, because this is stuff that's really interesting to explore yourself, and you might find things that I never even thought of. Let's move on to enemies now. I don't want to go into each and every enemy I run into, but to sum it up, there are floating enemies who shoot mid to long range skills, and walking people who use mid to close range skills. And there are a few variants in between. I'm more interested in talking about the actual AI of the game. Generally speaking, the enemies are really good at attacking and defending, and since they have access to all the same skills as us, we get ourselves stunned, knocked down, and our abilities sapped quite often. This to me is actually good game design. Most video games has it so the player is the one doing all the cool stuff, but not Phantom does. It isn't interested in making the game easy for you, because very rarely are you going to find yourself just running through the missions. I just kind of wish that the ally that we get is a little bit better in some of the missions. It kind of feels like they're either going to get knocked out early or are just going to run around not doing anything. Although there is one mission where I was running around and my ally just ripped the enemies apart without like my help whatsoever. It was actually great. Although I'm pretty sure that was JD, so that makes a lot of sense. He's amazing. On to the skills now. This is where things get a bit complicated. For the most part, your skills are either going to be infinite use or single use. Some skills have extra costs like health, the loss of aura, or the skill might cost more aura the next use. Skills with extra costs or single use tend to be a bit stronger than the infinite use ones, but there's the risk of missing, of course. After that, skills can be divided on how they path to their target, unless it shoots straight and then which is not labeled. And for each of these attack skills, there's a specific defensive skill to counter it. These can work for other things, but it really depends on a lot of factors, depending on what type of skill you're using for which class and whatnot. I have them all up on the screen right now if you want to pause and read them, just because I don't want to go through each and every one of them. I don't even know all the defensive skills really, to be honest. I prefer to just use the general ones that block as many things as possible, because these things can get pretty complicated, but each school has at least one or two that generally works for almost everything. The complications really don't end here though, because there are still variations of all these skills, and especially the attack skills. For the clips I've been using a lot, I've been using a tornado skill, and it's probably one of my favorites in the game, but there is a stronger version of it. It's called Whirlwind, and I guess it's fine. Even with the extra damage, I still prefer the weaker version. The enemies can dodge or block them, and that means you have to spend more time waiting for your aura to recharge. Blaze Sword is a stronger version of Flame Sword, but it can only be used if you have more than 15th health, which means that it can be entirely useless if you don't get it early in the match. And then there's a whole bunch of skills that don't really seem that different from one another, but just have different cost and damage output. Sorry, it's the editor here. I just made a mistake while I was doing my recording. I kept calling it tornado, but it's actually twister. It's really the same thing. Tornado and twister are the same word. So tornado skill specifically is a 4 for 4, which means it costs 4 aura for 4 damage. But it will knock an enemy up in the air, and which drops them, causing at least 1 or 2 more damage depending on how high they were able to get knocked up. And the best part about the skill is that when you knock them in the air, if they're positioned right, they can bounce off the edge into the void. And this can do another 3 damage. It is beautiful. It's my favorite. If you get a perfect tornado skill, it can do 9 damage in a single hit. And that's just with 4 aura cost and no penalty. Flame Sword is another one of my favorite skills. It costs what it deals. It's a 3 for 3. And it can do this nice damage loop where you can knock an enemy down. And when it gets back up, you can just do it again. Most enemies don't actually bring melee defensive skills, so it can be reliable in that sense. I'm just going to go off track for a second here. The escape key or select button will refresh your hand, and I didn't notice this for an embarrassing amount of time. Usually when you start a mission, it'll pop up on the bottom of the screen, but because of my thoughts, I didn't notice it. I would always get into a match and look at my hand and then look on the field and then look at my enemies and see what I'm dealing with so I can like build a strategy up for a couple seconds. I never really read the bottom of the screen, so that's on me. But yeah, it's helpful. Alright, back on track. These kill loops and high damage tricks are useful, but they're really not always going to work. They're going to be enemies that'll erase your skills in aura, forcing you to return to your starting area and restock in a way. The usage of these skills are more common than one may hope, but it is a good challenge. They're just limitations on some of the skills that might not be super apparent at first, but this will require some experience. Generally, the obstacles in a map play a huge part in what you're going to use and when. I'm going to continue to use Twister as an example since it's my favorite and I know it pretty well. You might not be able to use it easily in some of the maps due to the enclosed spaces, but if you learn the fine details, you can bypass the previous limitations. Objects hanging on the ceiling can stop it, but if the ceiling is smooth, it won't, since it takes the height of the spot it was cast. This also means that if there's something like a branch or a road sign overhead, it will block the path. Sometimes when the twister reaches the end of its range or gets blocked by something or whatever reason, its animation will stop showing, but the effects of the skill remain, so an enemy can avoid an attack and then walk right into the radius of damage just because it is invisible anymore. This is obviously a bug, but I actually really like it. I just hope that this bug doesn't exist online since it could be pretty frustrating. So let's talk about the melee skills now. There are quite a few of them, many of which are either types of slashes or types of punches and kicks. The slashes can either have a 180 degree slash or one of those 360 degree slashes, which one's not really better than the other, but it can mean that if an enemy tries to dodge it, there's a chance that it will still hit, even if they were able to get partially out of the way, just the range of the attack can still hit them. I haven't used many of the melee skills that were punches and kicks, but there was one I did try and enjoy, which allowed you to breach the defenses of your foe and then deal a few points of damage because it's a multi-skill attack. Nothing wrong with the melee line of skills, it's just you can't rely on them to win every mission. In missions where you're fighting the big bosses, they become a waste of space. And it's the same problem with the Twister has, where they just become dead weight. I want to talk about the big bosses a bit more later on, but that's all I'm going to talk about right now. The next section of missions I want to talk about are related to the last type of skill that wasn't brought up during the tutorial. They are called environmental skills, and out of all the missions you experience them, none are more annoying than the inverted controls mission. I wanted to actually try it, but it was on the rig level where the place is not easy of map to deal with this kind of stuff. Maybe if it was like the palace level, I would have tried it. I just don't think the environmental skill is very fun on single player, but I think it could be fun with friends. Right now, environmental skills are just to punish the player, as the AI seems mostly unaffected by it. There are some ways to stop the effects during the mission, but it takes time for these orbs to spawn, and I may have just been kind of annoyed at this time period. I wasn't really interested in really putting myself into this. And this is because around this time in the game, you're going to start having a lot of trouble finding your missions. Most of the time, a video game is going to give you some kind of indicator on where your goals are, but not phantom dust. Running around from person to person is normal, and it's what you're doing for almost every mission. In fact, the NPCs will tell you to go look around for people who need help, so this was actually by design. Eventually, you'll be begging for all missions just to be given to just to one person, because like you're going to be running person to person over and over again every single mission. I have probably like a third of my footage is just me running around. The main problem is they started giving missions to different people around the time you start getting the environmental skills, and one of these people is called Mikan or Meekin. She's a nurse that can be found in the starting room, a room that far side of the map that has served no purpose to this point. I didn't know it at the time, so of course I ended up running from person to person for 15 minutes over and over again, and by the time I actually found my mission, I wasn't enjoying myself. The quest she sent you on really wasn't that important, but she might actually be. It just isn't clear how. She's apparently a nurse, but she kind of looks like she got her outfit from one of those Halloween spooktacular sales events. Before understanding the story, I thought they just found her wearing this outfit and figured she was a nurse. Now, I've been holding off on the story because it really is second to the combat. It seems like they knew what they were doing for the game, and what the game they wanted to make, but they didn't have a well thought out story to go along with it. The game opens up to a really cool cutscene in an unknown place. Unknown because we never visited it again, and not much is really said about it. There's assumptions, just not much is said. The woman narrator, who is this lady here, Freya, tells us the world is covered in strange dust, and that gives the espers their powers. Our two main characters are found in metal pods by a group of these espers. No one really has any memories of anything, and most of them don't even know their names. They seem to just give themselves names based on whatever sounds right. We get to pick our names, but we really can't type anything in. We just get asked one name at a time until they eventually stick us with Nanashi, but this means no name in Japanese. I like that. The other guy is named Edgar, but I really don't know how they got his name. Not clear. Maybe they just guessed it really well. The writers kind of want to be mysterious and convoluted about everything, so I had a bit of trouble finding out what's really happening. What's obvious here is Edgar used to be an astronaut. He flew too close to the event horizon of the black hole and got pulled in. Due to a gravitational time dilation, he got stuck for what he thought was 3 days, but after escaping, he realized 10,000 years had passed. Now, I don't understand how he escaped, and it is not elaborated on. Maybe he had some technology that would be able to bend the event horizon back enough to be able to escape. Something kind of like making a naked similarity type thing. I'm not really sure. I'm kind of just speculating. When he returned to Earth, he didn't find any humans. Just strange dust that covered the Earth. And the game never really explains what it is, and I kind of have a half-baked theory on it, but we'll get into that later. Edgar quickly realized he can control the dust and started to recreate the world from his memories. Eventually, he started to work on humans, but failed many times. On day 3475 after returning to Earth, he finally succeeded with Freya, his girlfriend from before leaving Earth. Then he created his best friend, our protagonist. He doesn't have a name, and I can't find one anywhere. After creating him, he stopped caring about the details and just started to create people. Mikan, whatever her name is, might be important, but it's never really clear how. Edgar writes about her being important and dresses her up in this slutty nurse outfit, so it's possible he had an affair with her, but it's I don't know. 44 days after creating Freya, he had a city full of people. And at some point, Edgar started to hate the world he created, but it wasn't really actually the real Edgar. See, upon defeating the game, defeating the game is not a real thing. You find out the real Edgar died 10 years after returning to Earth, and he created a copy of himself to carry on rebuilding humanity. This fake Edgar didn't like the world, so released an energy wave wiping out everyone's memory, leaving behind a memory of a strange ruin of the last place he saw Freya before leaving for space. Before fake Edgar, who I'm just going to call Edgar from now on, was able to follow through with his plans, our protagonist tried to stop him. Edgar and the protagonist fought, and during the battle, both Edgar and our protagonist were left unconscious. Freya decided to put us in those metal pods that the espers found us in, and for a good portion of the game, we're just really trying to figure out what's caused everyone to lose their memories, and then find Edgar after he rediscovered his. When the survivors learned that Edgar created everyone from the Phantom Dust, the people in the room that saw this lost all their will to live or something like that, and disappeared. The others blamed me that weren't in the room, and shunned me until I completed missions to satisfy them. Freya ends up telling us a lot of the same things that I just told you, and then talks about plastic people in a plastic world. And after we're done talking, we end up fighting her and two clones that she made of herself, which brings us to our final chapter. We get a few memory shards of Mikan and JD, and Mikan's referred to as Redhead in a few of these memory shards, but it's really unclear how she relates to Edgar. I have a kind of a theory around it. He writes about her being important in his diaries, but never exactly how she's important. Maybe he's an ex-girlfriend. The main story revolves around Freya being the romantic partner. I kind of think he cared for her, and it was kind of like one of those sexual attractions to one of the nurses. I'm guessing this was more sexual, obviously, due to the fact that the outfit he put her in is... The post-game has some extra missions and stories in it, but it's really hard to tell where any of these missions are, and there's no in-game way of knowing since there's no map markers. There are a few other characters with missions associated with them and stories that go along with them, but none of them are really as interesting as JD. JD is another minor character who I've brought up a couple times, and we run into him every now and then, and he's considered a legendary Esper. Before Edgar wiped everyone's memories out, the Esper Cuff Button, yes, that's his name, tried to kill JD and get rid of the competition in order to obtain an officer rank within the Esper organization, the Visions. The Visions don't matter to the story narrative, it's just story fluff and world building. Cuff Button succeeded in gaining his rank, but failed to kill JD. See, he woke up in one of the older hideouts and was able to survive by himself, but returned to the main hideout after running into us several times. As I said before, he proves to be one of the most useful teammates to bring along, and lives up to his status as a legendary Esper. Cuff Button confirms a lot of this in a post-story mission where he tries to kill us. He tells us we need to die, but won't actually do it if he beats us. I can see why JD survived. It's pretty obvious. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here though, since I actually have been avoiding talking about the final mission. This mission took me a few dozen attempts to beat, and it is because of the sheer difficulty of it. A few missions before this, we were forced to beat and destroy Freya, and Edgar is pretty pissed at me for that. So he creates another Freya, and then Edgar creates a copy of us, in which we have to beat. Upon beating our copy, Edgar and Freya, or I guess the clone Freya, or the other clone Freya, come and kill us, or try to fight us. I made the mistake of thinking this was probably going to be the final battle. For bosses, we never actually had to fight more than 3 at one mission. So after we beat our copy and then Edgar and Freya, they teleport us into the ruin, and they become a big monster. This whole battle thing frustrated me a little bit though, because my arsenal was not built to fight these big monster bosses. These guys are really unique in their battle style. You can't use normal skills. Melees won't work on them. Laser skills won't work on them. You have to build an arsenal to beat these guys. I mean, if this arsenal you're using works well for this, that's great, but the arsenal I use does not work well for this. So I left and rebuilt my arsenal from scratch and designed it specifically to defeat just the final 2 stages of this boss. Because there are 2 more stages after you defeat Edgar and Freya. I'll get to those 2 stages after I talk about the deck I built. It was pretty much tied around 2 skills, Swarm of the Moths and Judge of Anubis. Judge of Anubis is a little bit complicated, but not really. It essentially takes the health you lost during a mission and doubles back on the enemies. So if you have 10 health and the enemy has 20 health, it'll do 20 damage to the enemy. Pretty much one hit in everything in the game. Swarm of the Moths is a little bit different, but it just makes a skill cost 1 health to cast for a period of time to the enemy. These skills were pretty close to my whole strategy for beating this last 2 stages of the mission, but I first had to beat the first 2 stages before making it to the halfway point. And I'm not really motivated enough at this point to really keep giving it every attempt. Luckily, I discovered that I can kill myself 3 times just to skip the whole first half. So let's go over the second half now. The first part of this has a big boss that has 3 body parts you can damage, but the only important section is the top. You can destroy the other sections just to avoid them shooting at you, but I felt like this was killing time and resources, so I just kind of waited for the top to attack. This had a useful sound trigger, so I knew it when the force field was coming down. And once I could, I would use the Swarm of the Moths, and this would guarantee me about 10 or 11 points of damage. And I got really good at this part, even doing it without taking any damage whatsoever. Now the next part's what got me for a long time. See, I couldn't figure out when the best time was to attack this Freya, and it's really when the flying Freya has this small window open when she's about to attack. And it was a really tough fight, because she does so much damage and will punish you if you attack when you aren't allowed to. I was able to eventually use this strategy to beat her, but it took me a few more hours after this. Now I'm glad I beat it, but it was just a ridiculous difficulty spike that I just wasn't happy with. The game ends with our protagonist looking at the skeletal remains of Edgar, and it is assumed that he buried the craft containing Edgar's skeleton before walking into the desert. This concludes the main story, but it's only the start to understand the world. It wasn't clear at first, but looking back, certain things start to piece together. The story being told to us is from the perspective of creations made from dust, attempting to learn about their history, while their architect's copy keeps them ignorant to it. Our enemies are the failures of the architect, while their motives are compulsory. Through dialogue, we get the idea that enemies are constantly attacking, but this feeling isn't actually conveyed well through gameplay. The base's location is unknown to our position, to the areas we're fighting in, so it never really feels like anything's at stake. The non-Esper humans live underground, and we're supposed to be protecting them, but they don't exist to us. They're just memory shards that say that they sometimes find their way to the surface, where the Espers have to save them, but we never see them. The Visions themselves, overall, are just a ragtag group of sorcerers who live in the sewers, and their struggle is irrelevant. And irrelevant because no matter what happens, the worlds will always regenerate. Now, it is possible that this is all simulation, but I have very little reason to believe it. There are hints in the cutscenes and a few memory shards, but it really just doesn't add up to it. Upon beating the final mission, Edgar disappears, and we get to see the skeleton of the original. If it is all simulation, it would be Edgar's, and he's dead. It is obvious to me that Edgar, Freya, and the protagonist have been at this for a while, probably 2,000 years by the start of the game, and this would make a lot of sense since the world Edgar created is falling apart. Now, to understand Edgar's motives and the world he left behind, we need to look at the world he created. Edgar attempted to create humans many times, and eventually succeeded with Freya, then his best friend, and then created a world for them to live in, so to feel a sense of normality, which is perfectly reasonable for a human to feel. Edgar eventually died, but he left a copy of himself to take over. But this was a terrible world. You could build a dollhouse and fill it with dolls, but that won't make it real. He was alone, and even Freya couldn't help him. When his best friend went against his will and fought him, it left them unconscious. Freya put the protagonist and Edgar in the metal pods to prevent them from continuing the cycle, but she couldn't stop the Espers from opening the pods. Her only goal now was to hopefully prevent them from regaining their memories. This didn't work out, as the protagonist was persistent and capable. Regaining these memories wasn't a problem. And eventually, Edgar got his memories back, and Freya needed a new way to let Edgar be at peace. Previously, Edgar had always been too powerful, so ending his suffering wasn't really an option. That was, until Freya saw how powerful the protagonist had gotten. She decided to give her strength and will to the protagonist, in the hopes to finally give Edgar peace. Now, I want to ask the question what the Phantom Dust is. When I came up with the theory it was a simulation, it gave an easy answer for the dust. The dust is just a medium for the simulation, but this isn't one. In a realistic world, it would need to be a substance that doesn't decompose, even after 10,000 years after it was created. It would need to be, at least in part, strong and flexible so it could be chained together and form buildings. It would also need to be abundant enough to build a city out of. This is why I believe the dust is just the garbage of humankind left behind, broken down into dust from weather and time. A combination of plastics, glasses, and whatever else that doesn't really decompose. Now, this wouldn't really likely change the atmosphere of the planet, and it was likely whatever killed the humans did that. This theory only came when I heard Freya say the plastic people thing, so it's really not much to go off of. Unfortunately, I don't have anything else either. The reality is, the dust is just a medium for the abilities for a game setting. As much as I want to ask what it is and find the answer, there really doesn't need to be one. Every single video I've ever watched about Phantom Dust's story never really gives an explanation to it, and I really think I understand why now. No one knows what's really happening beyond surviving humans have powers, they have named Espers, and they need to find their memories. Even though the Espers' hunt for their memories is the main focus, it's not important. They're just illusions to keep Edgar company until his death. Myken will show you the cutscenes again if you visit her, which has been very useful for this video. And yes, they incorrectly labeled the cutscene numbers. That, or I somehow missed a cutscene, but I really just think they mislabeled them. Now, I don't want to insult the game as a whole, since the combat is bloody amazing, but the story is just kind of fine. It's kind of hard to understand if you aren't giving it your full attention, and the dialogue makes it hard to care. I am relatively confident I missed information in dialogue, but it's mostly monotonous. In one of the cutscenes, the Visions is the name given to all of Edgar's creations, but in memory shards, it's the organizations that make up the Espers, and to the Espers, the Visions are organizations that protect humans and don't include them. So things get a bit confusing when it comes to naming things. And then we get a lot of random missions where we're supposed to find random things, but really we're just there to defeat enemies. And there are a couple missions where we're sent to find these terrible recipes for the bar, but I don't really understand why. The fact that these exist makes me question so many things about the world. Like, do the plastic people eat? Who grows the food? And where are they processing it? I don't think the 10,000-year-old Kansas tomatoes would even exist, let alone be edible. but I'm going to digress from here.
Is our leader.
I didn't notice while editing the video, but it turns out Edgar's name was written on the locket, but the way they said it, it made it seem like they guessed his name and were like, oh yeah, unrelated, but we looked at your locket and noticed the image of a girl.
We saw your
And unless you pay close attention, you won't even notice the name. We never really get a clean look at the engravings, but if you do get a glimpse of it in the opening cutscene. It's a bit of a nitpick, but come on, it's important context for his name. They could have said something like, "You don't mind us calling you Edgar, do you? We noticed the name engraved in your locket." It would have communicated where the name came from way better. And yeah, I know I'm not a good voice actor. I'm aware of this. I hear myself in my recordings all the time. It's awful. I brought this up before, but I didn't elaborate on it much. Many of the missions require you to put these skills in your arsenal to use them, but if you don't read the mission brief, then you're going to find out in the mission. And at this point, you have to quit the game so you can rejoin it and edit your skills to put it in your deck. Something that I would have liked to see in the game is an edit arsenal option inside the mission select, just a menu that allows you to edit your arsenal between attempts or in the mission select so you don't have to run back to this room just to change things. And I know many of the missions are designed just to make the player struggle, but why make such an important mechanic difficult to access? Challenging the player is fine, but make it a little easier to fix our decks. Even reading the mission briefs and then running back to this room is too much in my opinion. Some of the missions are on the other side of the map from the editing room, and it's really, really inconvenient. Now I know I started things off by saying this wasn't a bad game, but that's mostly because of nostalgia. This game has a few glaring issues that would make many players stop playing before they ever even got to the good part. And when they start getting to the good part, they aren't really given that many incentive to continue playing. The mission rewards are incredibly basic, and there's no real guidance, and your editing system is incredibly inconvenient. And it doesn't matter if it's a main mission or a side mission, your rewards are pretty much going to be the same. And it's like this for every mission, even the final one. Like, thanks for the 800 credits, a memory shard that's about a tutorial, and a skill I already have 8 of. I want to suggest this game to free people, because it's free to play, but it really can't suggest it to everyone. Just the people who are okay with spending 2 hours in a tutorial and don't care about running from person to person every single mission. Or about having to quit just so they can edit their arsenal. It's just a few quality of life changes would have made a huge difference for the players. And I don't think that many players would have cared about the story if they felt like they had things to do. There are a few subplots that I really didn't talk about, but that's because they really aren't that interesting to me. They are just fragmented stories that aren't adding anything to the larger experience. Freya is important, but only in that she's Edgar's girlfriend, and that we have to fight her multiple times. No one has a backstory from before Edgar left for space, and the main character doesn't even have a name. To me, it seems like most of the focus was on the card-style combat system, and then they built this after the fact. And I don't want it to come across, this was by no means a huge production for Microsoft. This was just in the hopes to sell more Xboxes to the Japanese market. And now I can't find the official reason why the game failed, but this is way ahead of its time. Apparently the developers didn't have the original source code, so they had to reverse engineer things for this 2017 re-release. And this includes hacking things to make the changes they did want to make. I just wish they were able to give us map markers at the very least. That would have changed the gaming experience so much. There's like a menu option you can do to like open up a website, but the website doesn't lead anywhere because they didn't pay for the domain or whatever. I'm not sure how that works. Earlier in the video, I was going to suggest an alternative to the long tutorial, but it felt a bit pretentious for me to say I knew better. That suggestion was just going to be a testing area for skills rather than forcing players to redo missions to test things. Reason being, it's kind of hard to test a skill sometimes because you need to actually pull the skill and then successfully use it, and some of these skills are single use, so if the enemy blocks it or something, then you're not really getting the experience of the skill, and if you only had one of them, you pretty much got to redo the whole mission. I personally just feel like it would have been nice to have some empty room similar to the one we get in the skill description when we see the animation, just to try our skills out in and get a feel for it. Just have like an enemy on the other side where we can shoot at it or something like that. Just something to make us feel like we can understand a skill. I don't believe everyone would use this feature, but invested players would certainly give it a try. This game came out for the original Xbox era, but it was designed for an online community, and back then there really wasn't much of it. It was very ambitious for its goals, and that was, I think, part of the reason why it failed. I really appreciate Microsoft for releasing this game for free, allowing me to get the nostalgia from the experience. Phantom Dust was an obscure game with a very niche cult following. It isn't the best game ever, but it's something special. I think that bringing back the Yukio Futsugi for a sequel would be an exciting news to hear. I don't think it's going to happen though. The company like Microsoft needs some pretty big incentives to start a production of a game that really didn't perform well originally. I still believe though that if they may were to make another game and do it right, there could be a really large player base. There are not many games that fill that deck building itch that people have. But yeah, thanks for watching. I appreciate you getting this far. I worked hard on this video, a lot harder than I'm probably ever going to see for it. But that's fine. I think that this game was complicated because of translation issues. And there's still a couple of things I couldn't figure out. Like, I really want to find out what this binary code was in the guard. But because when I put it in the binary translator, I think it's still originally a Japanese characters, so when I put in the binary, it didn't register. So I couldn't figure out what that said. I would like to though. But yeah, give it a try. I do think that people would like this game. And I am out.